Hello everyone, my name is Elliot Geltz, and today I am bringing you the full timeline of the Conjuring films. These films have been going on for quite a while. They've built up quite the narrative continuity, and it can get confusing at times to keep track of everything that has gone on and is going on with most recent films. So I have compiled all of the films and all of the events in the narrative universe of the Conjuring movies, the Annabelle movies, and the Nun movies into a single coherent story from start to finish with everything important that happens and some other things that are less important. So, The Conjuring begins in The Nun, which takes place in 1952 but features events from earlier in history. Things start in the 15th century in a town called St. Carta, where an evil duke engaged in occult and satanic rituals that summoned a demon named Valak from hell. Now, righteous authorities engaged him in time and stopped him from fully summoning Valak, but Valak still had a foothold in the living world, and that was an issue that had to be dealt with. So an abbey was constructed on top of the site, or the rituals had been done in an abbey, and they were like, hey, this is convenient, and they just moved in there. I forget which one. Anyway, in the abbey on top of the site where Valak was summoned, an order of nuns took up residence and kept him contained by continuously praying in the cathedral of the abbey. So every day, 24 hours a day, at least one person was in there praying, and this act of devotion kept Valak from fully emerging into the living world and kept him sealed there. Fast forward to the events of World War II, a bombing run by a plane overhead cracked the seal that was holding Valak in place and caused it to slowly deteriorate over time until the events of The Nun in 1952. In 1952, the seal completely cracked and Valak was free to rain mayhem over the abbey, and he killed pretty much every nun in there except for one who killed herself so that he wouldn't have a hold on her. A few weeks later, someone came to check up on the abbey, found everyone dead, no idea what had happened, oh my god, craziness, and they began to investigate. Over the events of the film, a Father Burke and a Sister Irene, a priest and a nun in training, go to investigate the abbey with a local French-Canadian man named Frenchie by the locals. His actual name will come to play later. Burke, Irene, and Frenchie all go to investigate the abbey. They find Valak running the place and causing all sorts of mayhem. They get terrorized by him over the course of the movie, and they discover a relic that was hidden in the abbey containing a vial of the blood of Christ. And with that, they banish Valak back to hell and secure the abbey and make it safe again. The thing that goes wrong is over the course of their fight with Valak, he gets a hold of Frenchie physically. And at first it looks like he's just strangling him to murder him. And then Irene saves him and drives Valak back, and Frenchie's okay. But Frenchie's not okay. In the stinger of the movie, we see the back of Frenchie's neck. He has an inverted cross branded on him, making him a vessel of Valak, and through him, Valak still has a foothold in the material world. Now that's our starting point, and already we see a whole lot that's just established as hard canon with this narrative. Hell and Christian lore is 100% real in this universe. And demons operate on kind of a permission basis. They need to be invited into the living world to have any kind of serious foothold to act and have power from, in the way that the Duke summoned Valak. They can also mark people and places the way Valak did Frenchie and the Abbey, meaning that once the doors open and they get a foothold in, they can then continue with their influence marking other things to gain territory, as it were, and more outlets to act from. This is followed up with The Nun 2, which released recently as of the uploading of this video. which takes place in 1956 and follows Irene as she once again encounters Valak in Tarascon, France. In France, Valak is hunting for the eyes of one Saint Lucy, a woman that was supposedly burned by a bad man that burns people, and she was left unharmed because of God's protection, and because of this she was rendered a saint. And her eyes, one of the last parts of her, which is gross, I don't know why you would save her eyes of all things, but whatever, her eyes supposedly still carry that power, and Valak wants to either, I don't know, take advantage of that or destroy them because they're a good thing or whatever. Anyway, over the course of the movie, Irene and another nun are terrorized by Valak. They find the eyes, and they banish Valak by performing the ritual of the communion or the Eucharist, which, if you're not familiar with Catholic canon, is the ritual by which a huddled mass of people, the people that go to a church for a sermon, the Mass will bless a portion of bread and wine, typically not literal wine, like alcoholic wine, but like grape juice. They will bless it so that it becomes either metaphorically or in some denominations literally the body, flesh, and blood of Christ, which they then consume, which is a whole can of worms we're not going to get into. But Irene and the other nun banish Valak back to hell by performing the ritual of the Eucharist, which turns all of the wine barrels around them and Valak into the blood of Christ, and like the first movie, they use this to banish him back to hell. There isn't a whole lot else that's established with the Nun 2. We see that certain people, either chosen by God to be specifically blessed, or for other means, have special divine powers or protections, but this doesn't really come up a whole lot over the course of the narrative, so it doesn't mean a whole lot. And the way they defeat Valak is kind of silly, so the Nun 2 is a dud in the franchise. We next hit something important with Annabelle Creation, the next movie in the timeline, which takes place in 1957 and explains the origins of the famous Annabelle doll that first appeared in the real world, like order of the film's releases in The Conjuring, but was so popular it got its own spin-off series as antagonist, where it receives an origin story and then things lead up to the events of The Conjuring. Anyway, in Annabelle Creation, a doll maker and his wife lose their daughter in a car accident. And in their grief, they reach out in prayer to God, begging to see their little girl again. And when that fails, they pray to anything that will listen. And unfortunately for them and a whole bunch of other people, something answers. It masquerades as the ghost of their daughter and begs them to permit it to possess a doll the doll maker has made in his daughter's likeness so that it can be with them again. They say yes, and it turns out that this wasn't their daughter, it was a demon. This is the demon Malthus, and Malthus and Valak are going to be two of the most reoccurring and primary antagonists over the course of the series, so take note of both of them, because we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the two a lot. So, the dollmaker and his wife make the mistake of inviting the demon into the doll, giving it a foothold in the real world. Realizing their mistake, they take the doll and they seal it inside a closet of their house and plaster it with Bible pages to sanctify it, preventing the demon from acting much outside of the confines of the closet. So many years later, a nun and a bunch of orphan children show up on their doorstep, having been dehomed from the closing of their orphanage and looking for refuge while they look for a new place to call home. The couple invite them in. One of the children, lured by the demon, goes and opens the closet, unleashing the demon through the Annabelle doll. The demon goes on to mark one of the girls named Janice, and then gains a foothold through both her and the doll at the same time. So from that point on, for the rest of the movie, the demon is both committing acts through Janus as a physical vessel and through the doll, which it causes to move of its own accord and does supernatural, I don't know what to call them, spells, effects. It does creepy supernatural stuff in the vicinity of the doll, on top of making Janus do things by possessing her. So, the dollmaker and his wife are killed by Janus, and the nun and the rest of the girls seal both Janus and the doll back in the closet and escape the house. Later on, Janus escapes from the closet by prying apart the boards and finding a crawl space through, and the police raid the house and investigate it after it goes quiet and no one's heard from the dollmaker in forever. They find their bodies, they find the doll, and they take the doll as evidence in the investigation. So this point, where Malthus's influence seems to split from Janus and the doll being separated, it's important to note that the doll doesn't really act in any way supernatural or terrifying after the split until a point later on. And I'm going to explain more about that when we get to that point. But for now, it's important to note that Malthus seems to have gone with Janus and not with the doll. His influence and his everything is going with her, not the doll. So, moving on. From Annabelle creation, we come to Annabelle, which takes place in 1967. Annabelle follows the story of John and Mia Form, a suburbanite couple living in some town, America. It doesn't really matter. John and Mia have a fight, which they then make up from, and John gives Mia a gift, and because she's a doll collector, he gives her a doll. And you get 3 guesses as to what doll he gives her, and the first 2 don't count. It's the Annabelle doll. Somehow, the Annabelle doll from police custody in 1957, over the course of 10 years, has circulated and traded hands, and now comes into John and Mia's possession. Their next-door neighbors, the Higgins, have an adopted daughter that ran away, and they wrote her off as, oh, she's gone to join some hippie commune, because it's 1967, and all they hear about her is that she's a part of some strange group. Well, it turns out she joined a satanic cult called the Disciples of the Ram, and assumingly Malthus, still possessing her, pushed her into being a part of the cult, where it gained influence over them by performing satanic abilities and whatnot, until it garnered followers in the cult, one of which goes with Janus back to the Higgins home, which at this point, the Malthus is possessing her under the name of Annabelle. It took Janus, infiltrated the American adoption network, and was adopted by the Higgins under the name Annabelle. So now she's known as Annabelle Higgins. Her original name was Janus. That's important to keep the continuity going. Anyway, Annabelle, formerly known as Janus, and her boyfriend from the cult attack the Higgins and murder them, and then attack the Forms next door. The boyfriend from the cult gets beat up and grievously hurt by John, while Mia gets injured. And things go very quickly in that scene. It's kind of weird. But the gist of it is that Annabelle, formerly known as Janus, possessed by Malthus, hears cops coming, knows his vessel is going to either end up killed or end up in prison, and in an attempt to keep his hold on the world, in order to keep his foothold, he takes Annabelle, formerly known as Janus, and takes the Annabelle doll, recognizing it from Mia's collection, and performs a ritualistic suicide with Annabelle, formerly known as Janus, such that her blood gets into the Annabelle doll, and his influence goes back to it. That is entirely ridiculous. It really is, but it makes more sense when you put it into the perspective of Annabelle, the movie, was released first, and then Annabelle creation was made. So originally, what people took away from Annabelle, the movie, was, oh, the doll was evil because this crazy cult lady committed a random attack on this couple and snapped and killed herself, and when her blood went to the doll, she haunted it. That's how it got evil. no, you were wrong. You were misled by a messed up continuity. It was really evil before that, but then it became not evil. And then with the attack in 1967 in Annabelle, it became evil again. This is why I'm making the video. We're not even halfway through this, and there's already a weird thing that would confuse you if you were watching these in the order they were released and you got to a new thing that overwrote an old thing. And that's why we're here. You're welcome. Anyway, Annabelle the movie. The doll is now possessed by Malthus again. It terrorizes the forms, particularly Mia form, by making her see things that aren't there, causing freak accidents like fires to start in their home, and finally driving her to the point where she's ready to give it her soul so that it will leave them alone and stop terrorizing their baby, their newborn baby. She starts the movie pregnant. That was an important part. I'm sorry I left that out. Anyway, over the course of the movie, Mia Form befriends another lady named Evelyn, who lost her daughter in a car accident that she was at fault for. It was her fault that her daughter had died, and she feels really guilty about it. When she gets brought into the Forms' inner life and sees everything going on with Malthus terrorizing them, she concludes that her reason for surviving the accident and continuing to live, despite having lost her daughter, was so that she could be here in this moment to appease the demon with her soul, so that the Forms wouldn't have to suffer the same pain she had suffered when she lost her daughter. And the big climax of the movie is Evelyn throwing herself from a window with the Annabelle doll, giving her soul to the demon so that it will be appeased and leave the Forms alone. Now, at this point, we've encountered and seen a great deal about how demons in this universe work, what rules they have to follow, and what their goals are. When we go back to Valak in the Nun movies, he doesn't really seem to care about claiming souls at all, in the same way Malthus is in the Annabelle movies. He seems more occupied with just having influence in the mortal world. He seems occupied with finding the relics of saints that have holy power, whereas Malthus seems entirely engaged with the claiming of souls. Across all of the Annabelle movies, that's his whole shtick. That's what he wants, that's what he's after, that's what he's hunting for. That's everything comes down to him wanting to get a soul of some kind. Valak never does that at all. That's weird. And my theory, this is never stated outright in the movies, but my theory is that demons are bound by primarily two rules. One, they need permission of some kind from a mortal to set foot in the mortal world, be it occultists conducting rituals or fooling mortals into allowing you into the mortal world by impersonating a loved one of theirs that has died and is now on the other side. Somehow they need permission to get a foothold in, and from there they can spread their influence, mark objects the way Malthus does the Annabelle doll, mark people the way Malthus does Janus, and the way Valak does Frenchie, and from there they can spread their influence more and more. The other thing is souls. I believe the demons of this universe need souls to power their abilities, like batteries. Whenever they make the ghost of a dead person appear to spook someone, or they move an object, or they start a fire, or something, they are consuming power that has to be replenished with souls. And I don't think Valak is occupied with getting souls, because he doesn't need them, having more of a in-between between him being partially in hell and partially in the mortal world due to his summoning being interrupted when the Duke summoned him way back in the 1500s. I think that left him kind of half and half, such that he doesn't need fuel to operate because he's kind of already partially fully in the world. Whereas Malthus is still technically fully on the other side. He just has influence in the mortal world and has to reach further to make things happen, which takes more energy. Therefore, the focus on souls. That's just a theory. That's just something I've pieced together based on what the films have presented, and we'll see more of this later on. It's never outright said, but I like it and it fits, and that's good enough for me. Moving on. After the events of Annabelle, the next movie is the original Conjuring, which takes place in 1971. However, there are two events that take place between these 2 points in the timeline that are very important. The first is that Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are the protagonists of the Conjuring movies and are the main focus of the franchise. These are real people. Ed and Lorraine Warren were real people who performed supposedly real exorcisms and weighed in on spiritual matters all over the world. And the premise of the first Conjuring movie was a dramatization of something they were a part of. And from there, the franchise just went crazy. So anyway, between the events of Annabelle and The Conjuring, the Warrens perform an exorcism on a man named Maurice. This is important because Maurice is the real name of Frenchie, the local French-Canadian who helped Father Burke and Sister Irene during the events of The Nun in 1952. They attempt to exorcise Valak from him and kind of succeed, except Valak grabs a hold of Lorraine, the wife to Ed, who was the husband to Lorraine. That's how marriage works. He grabs a hold of her in the same way he had grabbed a hold of Frenchie to mark him, but fails to mark her. This could be because of her very strong Christian faith. This could be because she has these sort of clairvoyance powers that might give her a layer of protection a normal person wouldn't. It could be both things. The movies aren't 100% clear, but for some reason, she's protected from the mark, and Valak has very limited influence in the world because of this. The exact nature of Valak and Lorraine's connection isn't 100% clear, and I'll get to why in a few more movies. But take note of this moment where they exorcise Maurice and things get kind of weird with her and Valak. We're going to put a pin in that and we're going to come back to them. Anyway, the second thing that happens that's of note is the Warrens come into possession of the Annabelle doll. After Evelyn committed suicide in 1967, the doll obviously went back into police custody as a part of the investigation into her suicide. It then escapes or gets put out or thrown in the trash or whatever happens to old evidence, and then circulates around in thrift stores and whatnot until it is bought as a present for a nursing student that is then lied to by Malthus, saying it's the ghost of a little girl that just wants to make friends. The nursing student and her friends welcome the ghost to possess the doll, and Malthus starts terrorizing them until they contact the Warrens to come and help them, who then take the doll into their custody. Now, that's weird. That's very weird, because Malthus already had a foothold in the doll. It's not like when he left the doll as Janus in the closet back in 1957, because that was Malthus abandoning the doll for Janus, favoring her as its vessel so that it could escape the closet and go out and cause more mayhem, whereas the doll was kind of a dead end at that point, so he left it behind. Here, Malthus is still in the doll. The doll is still its only foothold in the material world, but for some reason, at this point further in the future, it needs permission again to possess a doll that it had already possessed and had permission to inhabit. That's very strange. And you could chalk this up to like the weird occurrence of Janus and the doll just happening to divert and meet again a decade apart, and the weirdness I talked about before. You could chalk this up to this plot point being introduced in the first Conjuring movie, and then as they continued to produce movies, the writing got haywire, and this was a plot hole they just couldn't patch over. I disagree. I think that between the events of Evelyn's suicide and the Warrens' intervention with the nursing student, Malthus had lost so much power and had gone so long without claiming any kind of soul or anything that he was so weak he couldn't do anything, even though he had a foothold with the doll, and so needed the nursing student and her friends to give it permission so it could get just a little bump up in power to get back into the doll and start causing mayhem to make them fearful, and hopefully for him, not hopefully like we hope for it to happen, he's hoping to terrorize the nursing student and her friends to the point that they're willing to trade a soul to make it stop, like Evelyn had prior. However, the Warrens intervened before they reached that point. Those two things don't get movies of their own. They are brought up and come back to repeatedly. It's roughly this frame in the timeline that those two things happen. We then get to The Conjuring in 1971, the very first movie. So, the events of The Conjuring. In 1971, a couple named Carolyn and Roger Perrin and their 5 daughters move into a dilapidated house in Rhode Island. From there, they start to experience supernatural phenomena that escalates to the point of them feeling like they are in danger from a supernatural force. This includes their dog being murdered, their daughters being terrorized, their daughters seeing people and shapes and phenomena in their houses, and it culminates in people getting locked in the basement of the house, being physically attacked by the demon, all sorts of things. Carolyn goes to a seminar being performed by the Warrens where they talk about cases they've worked on and other supernatural phenomena they've experienced. Key in point, they talk about the exorcism of Maurice and show footage of the exorcism where Maurice, who, as stated in the movie, had a 3rd grade education and wasn't very engaged in classic literature or anything, recited perfect Latin at them and conducted other feats that, as far as anyone knew, he shouldn't be able to, up to and including an inverted crucifix appearing under his skin in his abdomen, which, oof, that really sucks for him. Carolyn speaks to the Warrens and convinces them that something very real and very dangerous is happening in her house. The Warrens come to investigate, corroborate this, and begin an investigation where they discover so many years ago a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, which, that's a hell of a name, had lived in the house with her husband, had a child, and then a week later sacrificed the child in a satanic ritual, and then committed suicide, all the while proclaiming her love for hell and its abominations up to her death. This is of note because this is the first mortal antagonist of the films, if you discount things like the doll maker and the people possessed by Valak prior. This is the first mortal person, a human being, that is deliberately and with malice inflicting harm on the world, and then comes back as a spirit of some kind to haunt the property she died on and continue inflicting everlasting harm. So in the cosmology of things, this fits in with the demons and the rules they obey that I mentioned earlier. It would appear that a mortal person can dedicate themselves to dark forces so fervently that Bathsheba's soul ends up tied to the property she died on, and she is allowed to continuously haunt it and hurt people, and the parents are her latest victims. The latest in a very long line of such. So, Ed and Lorraine do the best they can. They exorcise Bathsheba. They save the family. Yay. That is the end of The Conjuring in 1971. Next up is the movie Annabelle Comes Home. I'm not a big fan of Annabelle Comes Home. I don't think it's very good as a horror movie, and it also doesn't add a whole lot to either the continuous narrative of the movies or the cosmology and how things work in this universe. It's kind of its own little pocket of shenanigans that happens and doesn't have a big impart on anything. So, the events of Annabelle Comes Home. The Warrens leave their daughter at home to go out on business and hire their regular babysitter to watch over her. the babysitter invites a friend over, and the Annabelle doll, which is not enshrined, it's like entombed, I guess is the better word for it, is entombed in a glass cabinet made of church window glass inside a room that is regularly blessed by a priest and sealed by the Warrens. It's where they seal a whole bunch of evil stuff like the Annabelle doll that they've collected from different jobs they've done that can't be destroyed or otherwise safely stored, so they keep it in this SCP containment vault room of their house. The babysitter's friend is influenced by Malthus to enter the room and release the doll with the image of her dead father. She starts to see his ghost, and Malthus uses the image of her father to lure her into the room and convince her to open up the cabinet the Annabelle doll is stored in so that it can be free again to terrorize people. And that's exactly what it does for 2 hours, and not a whole lot else happens. The girls eventually get the doll back in the case, and that's it. Everyone, happy ending, yay. Which I'm happy. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I wanted a downer ending. It's just not a whole lot that's interesting happens over the course of the movie. The only thing that is of note, the only thing over the whole movie, is at a certain point Malthus grabs a hold of the Warren's daughter, pins her down, and it looks as if he's sucking her soul out of her. So prior in like Annabelle, we had seen that Malthus will go to great extents to bargain and push people and get them to give it a soul as if it needs that, as if it can't just claim a soul. It needs someone to give it to it in the same way a demon needs to be given permission to enter the material world. It needs to be given a soul, it can't just take it. However, right here we see it taking a soul. And I don't know if that's just Malthus had enough power and influence that he could just take it and otherwise he didn't. Like in Annabelle, his battery was too low, so he couldn't just take a soul, whereas in Annabelle Comes Home, somehow his battery is high enough that he can just claim a soul. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the implications of that are so heavy on how the cosmology works that it has to be talked about. I think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Kind of wish I could just scrub the movie from the timeline, but it's there and we gotta deal with it, and there it is. Next up is The Conjuring 2, which takes place in 1977. Speaking of things that make no sense, the events of the movie start with a British family in London. I'm pretty sure it's London. It might be a different town. It might as well be London. It's Britain. Who cares? The events start with a British family that is being terrorized by a ghost in their house. Meanwhile, in America, the Warrens are dealing with the Amityville house, the infamous, yes, the Amityville house, investigating it. During that time, Lorraine receives a vision where Ed dies. She receives a vision where he falls onto like a sharpened stake and is impaled and dies, which freaks her the hell out. During this, she also sees horrible images of a monstrous face that, at the time, this was Valak's introduction, but following the timeline, we've seen Valak before and we recognize him for what he is. Valak is giving Lorraine this vision as a part of a grand plan, and I'm reluctant to use either of those words because it's kind of Looney Tunes and silly. He's giving her this vision as a part of a grand plan to lure Ed to his death. Valak supposedly has a big old grudge from the Warrens exercising Maurice and robbing Valak of his only influence in the material world. That plot point might make no sense. There's going to be more. I'll wrap them up together at the end of this. So, the Warrens receive contact from the British family. They go to investigate, and they find the house is possessed by a ghost named Bill Wilkins, who was a real person that lived in the house prior to the family, and now says things like he wants to see his family again, and they need to get out of his house, as if he doesn't realize that he's dead, as if he's a soul trapped there, haunting it, not maliciously engaging the people there, the way Bathsheba Sherman had. So the Warrens and several other authorities, like a priest and the police and whatnot, conduct investigations into the goings-on of the house. And one of the investigators secretly records evidence of one of the daughters of the family faking the events of a haunting. So she's in the kitchen with no one else, throwing things around and banging things to simulate the effects of a haunting. This causes everyone but the Warrens to lose interest in the case entirely and write off everything that's happened as fake. And the Warrens are kind of forced in their hand because of rules with the Catholic Church and how it treats hauntings and fakes. They have to leave the family. However, on the bus ride back to the airport, Ed and Lorraine listen to recordings of the ghost of Bill Wilkins from a seance they conducted earlier. And overlapping them, they put it together that Bill is the victim of a greater, more evil entity that is using him as a front to lure people in, to investigate, and then present things as a hoax so that they leave, leaving the family totally vulnerable to its machinations. The Warrens then turn around and go back to the family because now the haunting has been cranked up to 11. Ed goes running into the house. Lorraine goes running after him. And Ed runs into a second-story room to save the girl that had been made to fake the effects, which she had faked it because Valak had come to her and threatened her family and said if she didn't do it, it would hurt her and them. And that's why she did it. Anyway, Ed goes to get her out of the room, but Valak pushes him out a window, and he grabs the girl, and he's hanging by a curtain that's slowly breaking. And lightning strikes and breaks a tree in the front yard that creates the wooden stake that Lorraine saw in her vision where Ed dies. So he is dangerously close to coming to his death from that vision. Lorraine goes to confront the demon. And we know it's Valak based on having seen him in prior movies. But at this point, Lorraine did not. However, she did. Dun dun dun. That's a stupid joke. That's how the movie presents it. She literally says, I don't know its name. Wait, I do. And then this happens. It's very silly. Anyway, during her vision earlier, where she had first seen Ed's death, in the vision, she was scribbling in her Bible. In those scribbles, she found the name of the demon Valak, confronted it, and then banished it back to hell by the power of knowing its name, which is a very, very common... I'm reluctant to call it a trope, but you could consider it a trope, where in a whole lot of belief systems, knowing the name of a supernatural creature, especially a demon, gives you power over it. It's a fixture in very old Judaistic lore. It's a fixture in a lot of stories. It's a whole thing. And put a pin in it, it's added to the cosmology here, on top of the other rules that govern how demons can operate and what they do. They have a very big weakness in if someone knows their name, they can take full authority over them and banish them back to hell. Add that to the list. Lorraine banishes Valak, saves Ed, they save the girl, everyone's happy, yay! That's the end of The Conjuring 2. Now, I'm reluctant to continue calling things silly and Looney Tunes because I do genuinely like these movies and I like the continuous narrative they've built as a whole. There's just some silly things that don't make a whole lot of sense. Like the Janus and the doll getting separated and then reunited as a result of old lore being overwritten by new lore. Another one is this. It's Valak's plan. It makes no damn sense. His whole plan starts with the Warrens banishing him from Maurice, robbing him of a foothold in our world, which he resents them for and wants revenge for. But he does have enough of a foothold through him having touched Lorraine, who he hasn't fully marked and possessed the way he had Maurice, Frenchie. But he somehow has more power because Lorraine is all the way in America, and from his conduit through Lorraine, which is weaker than his conduit through Maurice, because Lorraine is protected, like I said, through his weaker conduit through Lorraine, he can reach all the way to England and subjugate and terrorize a human ghost to haunt a property and orchestrate all this stuff to bait the Warrens across the Atlantic so that did Valak cause the lightning strike that broke the tree? Did he cause the storm? Does he have power over Earth's natural phenomenon while having a weaker foothold in the world than he did when he possessed a dude and yelled a lot? It makes no sense, and it's very silly. It's one of the weakest points in the narrative, and I have to bring it up because it's such a major thing. It's the whole plot of the second Conjuring movie. It's the whole plot of the second installment in the main line of movies. I have to bring it up. It's very goofy. I'm sorry. I genuinely do like these movies. Please watch them. They're very good to good for the most part. Anyway, our last movie in the timeline is The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It from 1981. Now, in 1981, the Warrens go to perform an exorcism on a young boy who is experiencing possession. Also present for the exorcism are the boy's older sister and her boyfriend, Arnie. He's the only one that's really relevant. The other two aren't. During the exorcism, Arnie, desperate to save his girlfriend's little brother, incites the demon to possess him instead, which is a very bad thing because, as we've seen, demons operate based on permission. The demon moves from the boy to Arnie, and before the Warrens can intercede, Ed starts to have a heart attack, and Arnie flees from the house and goes running off into the night, and choosing between chasing after this demon man and her husband who's actively dying, Lorraine chooses her husband. Ed wakes up in the hospital later, mostly fine. Arnie is still out on the run, and they come to find out that he has killed a man. He kills his landlord by stabbing him 22 times in the chest, which is a lot of times to stab somebody. Typically results in a death, and it does here. The Warrens participate in Arnie's trial. They're not his defense or anything like that. They're just brought in as witnesses to bear witness to the events of the exorcism and say that Arnie is not responsible for his actions because he was demonically possessed, which the mundane courts of America typically don't smile upon. This is reflective of real-life events. Some of these movies, like the first Conjuring, the second movie, and The Devil Made Me Do It, are very loosely based on real events the Warrens were a part of, and this is one of them. A man really did commit murder while in a psychotic episode of some kind, and his defense was that he thought he was demonically possessed. I don't know the outcome of that real-life trial. I'm here to talk about the fictional narrative, not the real events, so we're just going to pave past that and keep talking about the story here. So, the Warrens conclude that the only way to save Arnie, both from his fate at trial and the possession, is to stop the demon possessing him. This takes a twist when a similar instance occurs where a woman goes crazy, stabs somebody 22 times, and then kills herself. The Warrens investigate that and come to meet a former priest named Craster, who is familiar with the Disciples of the Ram, the cult that the possessed Janice and had interacted with, taken leadership of, and was a part of up until her death during the events of Annabelle. The priest Craster informs the Warrens that a witch of the cult is deliberately targeting these people and sicking a demon on them for the purposes of feeding the demon souls. She has made a pact with it that if she will give it permission to attack people, letting it attack them and letting it harvest their souls, she can get something, either witchy power or be like Bathsheba, and after death be instilled on the world as a force of evil. The narrative doesn't ever explain what her end goal is. We do get speculation from the priest that there isn't an end goal. People like this are like the Joker. They just want to see the world burn. But he's kind of an unreliable narrator, as I will get to shortly. So the Warrens pursue this lead of this witch that is crafting little dolls that and then putting them under people's houses, marking them as permissible for the demon to attack. They come to track her down and isolate her possible lair as this sewer system on the outskirts of town. While investigating the tunnels, the witch attacks the priest, at which point... No, it's prior to this. I'm sorry. So prior to this, the priest reveals that the witch was his daughter, and that in his studies of the occult, in order to combat them, she had developed a fascination with the occult to gain power and had respect for dark forces. And that is how she ended up becoming a witch and serving the disciples of the Ram and the demon that she is at this point working with. After that's revealed, the Warrens go to the tunnels, and then the witch kills him. I got a little ahead of myself. I'm sorry. The witch kills him, goes back to the tunnels, sicks the demon on Ed, who would be her third and final soul that she has to offer to the demon. However, Lorraine, in self-defense, fighting Ed off, reminds him of the first time they met and their love for each other, and beseeches him to use the strength of that love to fight off the demon. And this works. Ed fights off the demon and gets back control of himself despite being possessed. We've only seen this one other time, and that was back in The Conjuring. During the events of The Conjuring in 1971, Bathsheba possesses the mother of the family, Carolyn Perron, and in her physical body attacks their children. During that time, Lorraine beseeches her to remember her love for her children, and with that strength, fight off the control of Bathsheba. This doesn't entirely break Bathsheba's control. It only gets her stunned, I guess, long enough for Ed to get close, and with full authority, I don't know why this didn't work earlier in the narrative, but he forcefully banishes her back to hell. I guess being weakened by Carolyn's love for her children made her Bathsheba weak enough that Ed could fully banish her. I left that off so that I could bring it here and tie the two together. That was clever of me. Haha. I tricked you. Anyway, we've seen twice now another rule of possession in this universe. That particularly strong positive emotions like love can be leaned on and can give strength enough to resist the control of possession, either entirely breaking it in the case of Ed, or resisting it and weakening the possessing spirit long enough for someone to come in and banish it fully. Now, with the demon banished from Ed, Ed approaches the altar where the witch has been conducting her rituals, where all of her power is focused, and breaks it with a sledgehammer. This breaks the contract between the witch and the demon, and because the demon wasn't given all of the souls it was promised, it takes the witches instead as the final payment, dragging her off to hell, which I'm guessing she didn't really want because she's very upset about it when it happens. It would appear that that's how a mortal using dark magic works. The rituals are performed upon an altar or with physical objects of some kind, and the power being exercised by the witch, like exercises and used, not exercises and banished. The power being used by the witch is tied up in that physical object, and that's a weak point that can be combated, that breaking it robs the witch of their power and stops the evil shenanigans from continuing. So that is the complete timeline as of right now. The Nun 2 released very recently, like I said. It did fairly well for the 8th movie in a horror franchise. Typically things start to run a little thin by now with horror movies, but it did fairly well. People still like it. People are still watching videos like this one about it. So I think enough interest remains in the franchise that we could see more installments and we could see more lore dropped that I could add on to this and talk more about it. But for the time being, that is everything that has happened in the Conjuring timeline so far. That is everything we know. and I hope we'll get more soon. So until then, have a good night and bye.